we start, right? He has been telling you the difference between the absolute and the relative, the spirit and matter, and it is two opposite things, and the human mind cannot understand. And he has been explaining what are the basic problems of the mind. There are three mistakes it makes. That's what he is saying. So, I'll do one thing. I'll read out to you the summary of what he has said in the previous one, and then we'll start reading. Okay, so, yeah. So, what do we mean by the absolute? That's what he has said in the previous paragraph. We mean something greater than ourselves and the cosmos also, greater than ourselves and the cosmos. A supreme reality, God, transcendent being, without which nothing could exist. That's the first definition. Indians call it Brahman, the Europeans call it the absolute, because it is free of all relatives, which can exist only by the absolute, which contains them and their principles and truths. Yet it is something more than the sum of all relatives. Each and every relative, each and every form in the physical world is contained in the absolute. But the absolute is not merely the total sum of all such relatives. It is something much more than that. The absolute is ineffable. You can't explain this. To understand that the absolute is more than the sum of all things, a very good way of explaining that is to think of your human body. Okay, the human body is not a collection of organs. It is not heart plus liver plus stomach plus bones plus kidneys. It is, and brain. It is something much more than that. If you put all these into a basket, you won't get a human being. A human being is much more than the sum of all these things. They organically they combine together to make something even greater. That's basically what he's saying in the previous one. So now we start reading the next paragraph. Okay? And it goes like, so far there need be no real difficulty nor confusion, but we readily go on, led by the mind's habit of oppositions, of thinking by distinctions and pairs of contraries. Okay? We always, and contraries are very necessary in the physical world. If you don't have contraries, you will get very confused. Okay? So far, there need be no real difficulty nor confusion. But we readily go on, led by the mind's habit of oppositions, of thinking by distinctions and pairs of contraries, to speak of it as not only bound by the limitations of the relative, but as if it were bound by its freedom from limitations. It is even bound. When we think of God, we say God is omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent. But if you say that, then you are limiting him. Okay, he cannot be anything but omnipotent. So you are limiting him. That's the mind. That's what Swami is saying. But as if it were bound by its freedom from limitation, okay, inexorably empty of all power for relations, and in its nature incapable of them. This is what many philosophers also say. The physical world cannot have been made by the divine because it's full of perversions and ignorance and cruelty and uh, all the opposite, limitations and falsehood. How can it be the divine? It can't be the divine. So this is the normal human mind, the way it thinks. It has even gone to the extent of becoming a philosophical doctrine. Okay? So that Advaita contradicts. Okay? It can become anything it wants. It is not bound by its freedom. That's what he's saying. It is not bound by its freedom. It can even cancel its freedom and become limited. That's what Swami is saying here. Inexorably empty of all power for relations and in its nature incapable of them. This is what the mind thinks. Something hostile in its own being to relativity and its eternal contrary. But this false step of our logic, we get into an impasse. By this false step of our logic, we get into an impasse. Impasse is a French word, but it's also used in English. That means a dead end. Okay, cul-de-sac, as they say. Cul-de-sac means a dead end. There is no more, the road ends there. By this false step of our logic, we get into an impasse. I don't know in English how you pronounce it. Impasse, perhaps. Okay. You cannot pass beyond it. Impossible, if you want. Our own existence and the existence of the universe become not only a mystery, but logically inconceivable. For we get by that to an absolute which is incapable of reality and exclusive of all relatives, and yet the cause, or at least the support of relativity and the container, truth and the substance of all relatives. So we have a contradiction and we have a problem. If you think of, in terms of the mind, that contraries are irreconcilable. And in the mind, it is absolutely correct. You have to think in that way. We have then only one logical, illogical way of escape out of this impasse. We have to suppose the imposition of the world as a self-effective illusion or an unreal temporal reality on the eternity of the illusion, or an unreal temporal reality on the eternity of the, formless, relationless absolute. He is going to discuss this is the Advaita philosophy of the later, okay, the Mayavada philosophy. The relative things that are there are an imposition on the, it's like a picture which is superimposed on the reality of things. The reality is a blank, and on that reality you are superimposing a picture, and you think that the picture is real. That's what he's saying. This is the only solution you can have. You can get rid of the picture, you get back to the absolute. This is Mayavada philosophy. It's a adhyaropa. They call it an adhyaropa. Okay? Your mind is actually infinite, but your mind is being superimposed by a picture of limitedness. The surface is limited, and you are thinking that the surface is a reality. This imposition is made by our misleading individual consciousness, which falsely sees Brahman in the figure of the cosmos. As a man mistakes a rope for a serpent. He is discussing Shankara's philosophy. Okay? As a man mistakes a rope for a serpent. But since either our individual consciousness is itself a relative supported by the Brahman and only existent by it, not a real reality, or since in its reality it is itself the Brahman, it is the Brahman after all which imposes on itself in us this delusion and mistakes in some figure of our own consciousness an existent rope for a non-existent rope. This is the Shankaran philosophy. We'll finish the para and come back to it. Not a real reality, or since in its reality it is itself the Brahman, it is the Brahman after all which imposes on itself in us this delusion and mistakes in some figure of its own consciousness an existent rope for a non-existent snake. Imposes on its own indeterminable pure reality the semblance of the universe, or if it does not impose it on its own consciousness, it is on a consciousness derived from it and dependent on it, a projection of itself into Maya. But by this explanation, nothing is explained. The original contradiction stands where it was, unreconciled. But we have only stated it over again in other terms. It looks as if by attempting to arrive at an explanation by means of intellectual reasonings, we have only befogged ourselves by the delusion of our own uncompromising logic. We have imposed on the absolute the imposition which our too presumptuous reasoning has practiced on our own intelligence. We have transferred our mental difficulty into understanding the world manifestation into an original impossibility for the absolute to manifest itself in a world at all. But the absolute obviously finds no difficulty in world manifestation and no difficulty either in a simultaneous transcendence of world manifestation. The difficulty exists only for our mental limitations, which prevent us from grasping the supramental reality of the coexistence of the infinite and the finite, or seizing the nodus of an unconditioned with a condition. For our intellectual rationality, these are opposites. For the absolute reason, they are interrelated and not essentially conflicting expressions of one and the same reality. The consciousness of infinite existence is other than our mind consciousness and sense consciousness, greater and more capacious, more capacity, for it includes them as minor terms of its workings, and the logic of infinite existence is other than our intellectual logic. It reconciles in its great primal facts of being what to our mental view, concerned as it is with words and ideas, derived from secondary facts, are irreconcilable contradictions. Pretty complex paragraph, but the basic idea is very simple. If you start from the premise that the mind is the ultimate instrument of knowledge, you get into a problem where God is different from the physical world. And many people believe in it, okay? Yeah, if you want the God, you have to leave the physical world and go away elsewhere. It is still current. Many philosophies say that. But the Advaita philosophy is the only one which says no. But even in the Advaita philosophy, there are different interpretations. So what Sridhar is discussing here is the Shankaran philosophy, which is the Shankara, Advaita of Shankara. There are many Advaitas. There is Shankaran Advaita, there is Ramanuja Advaita, there is also the Madhvacharya and Vallabhacharya, all small differences. Okay. So Shankara says that the reality is absolute, and that is the absolute means the featureless, immutable, okay, eternal, infinite reality, which is without features, but it creates a physical world. Okay, the physical world is an imposition on the blank slate. They use the image of Shankara uses the image of a mirror. When you look in the mirror, you see yourself. You see something which seems to be real, but it's only a reflection. When you change your status and you go to the consciousness of the spiritual planes of consciousness, you see that this is only an image. You start seeing it as a picture. More importantly, we can use the image of the cinema and the screen. Okay? The cinema, when we are sitting, we are watching a film, that is our condition in the normal world. We are watching the world as if we are watching a cinema. Okay? And all action that is going on, you see traffic in the road, you see your friends coming, you are talking, you are eating, sleeping. All these are only images. They are the superficial images. This is what Shankara says. Okay? And you go to another level, you see them as only images and they get cancelled. You see the unreality of the physical world, and now what do you see now? You see only the blank screen, which is permanent and featureless. Even a cinema screen is white, but you can think of it as absolutely without even whiteness. Okay, and you can also, the cinema screen is limited to a rectangle, but you extend the rectangle infinitely, up, down, and left and right. This is the absolute immutable featurelessness. That is the reality. The only thing about it is featureless, no doubt, but it is so real that you see the physical world as unreal. Okay. So when you are in the lower consciousness, the images become real to you. That's what he is explaining normally. Okay. But this is provided you think that the mind is the ultimate capacity of understanding the reality. But there is another. If you go to the supramental world, you see that mind is not the ultimate instrument of knowledge. There is a knowledge which is beyond the mind, and you see that there is a connection between the highest and the lowest. Why do you want to limit God's powers? He can be absolute, but he can also be relative. He can be infinite, but if he chooses to be, he can also be finite. If he wants to be truth, he can be truth, but he can also appear to be falsehood. That is what the Advaita philosophy says. Okay? I'll do one thing. I'll read out the summary. We get the basic idea, and then we go into the sentence by sentence, so that we understand Sri Aurobindo language. Okay. So, I'm reading out to you the summary of it. So far, there is no problem, but the mental logic is not to be pushed away so easily. It trusts on its own ways, which is that of dualities and contraries. Now it insists that the absolute means it is incapable of relatives. This is what the mind says. How can the infinite be finite? It's not possible. That it is incapable of relatives, free from dualities. One more step in this logical sequence, and it says that the absolute is free from relatives and cannot have relatives. In other words, the absolute is restricted by its own freedom. Now, mental logic has painted itself into a corner out of which there is no exit. This is my language of what Sridhar is explaining. If you think that the mind is the only, then you have painted yourself into a corner and you are stuck there. Okay? The absolute is restricted by its own freedom. Now mental logic has painted itself into a corner out of which there is no exit. The only way out is to say that the universe of relatives is an unreality and it is superimposed on the pure blank slate of the self, just as a man in the dark mistakes a rope for a snake. This is no solution. We have to acknowledge that mental logic is far inferior to consciousness to that of the self. The mind lives. Just one second. Okay. Yeah. The mind lives in dualities and contraries, and the self does not. That's what we say. Okay. So this is what he's saying in the panel. Do not consider God to be limited to his omnipotence and infinity. He can be everything he wants. In fact, many others also have seen this reality. Okay. But if you get stuck at the spiritual planes of consciousness, you have a problem. That's why you have to go to the third level, that's the supermind, where you see the connection between the two. In fact, that is what he says in Love Divine much earlier. We have gone through it, but you may not remember. He says Buddha saw the physical world as unreal. Okay? Not Buddha, but Buddhism. Then Shankara comes and says, no, the world is real, but it is real in time and space. It is relatively real. Like there are so many things in the physical world which are relatively real if you consider real to be permanent. The cloud is relative reality, the shadow is relative reality, the blue sky is relative reality. There is no blueness, but you see it as blue, it is absolutely real to you. Okay? The rainbow, it is there in the sky, you go there, there is no rainbow. Okay? So these are all the relative realities. So you have to get out of your relativity and go to the absolute, you will see the reality. That is Shankara. But Sri Aurobindo says he should have gone one more step. And Buddha, Shankara has gone beyond Buddha. But now Sri Aurobindo says that he also should have gone beyond his own philosophy and seen that if you go to the supramental level, even the unreal forms in the physical world, there is a reality hiding behind these forms. The physical world is not total unreality. Only the superficial is unreal. Like the sea and the waves. The wave is unreal in this sense that it is born and dies, but the sea does not die. There is a divine presence in the physical world which is permanent and real. But it depends on what you are seeing. If you are seeing only the waves, you see the physical world and think that is unreal. That's what he's saying in the in this para. So we'll go back to the beginning of the, okay, so I'm going back to the beginning of the para. So far, there need be no real difficulty nor confusion, because he has said what the absolute is. Okay, the absolute is something, absolute is ineffable, you can't speak about it. But we readily go on, led by the mind's habit of oppositions, of thinking by distinctions and pairs of contraries, to speak of it as not only bound by the limitations of the relative, but as it were bound by its own freedom from limitations, inexorably empty of all power for relations, and in its nature incapable of them. So, I'll read that sentence again, you have to see carefully. But we readily go on, we, the human mind, led by the mind's habit, we means human beings, led by the mind's habit of oppositions, of thinking by distinctions and pairs of contraries, to speak of it. What is the it? The absolute. Okay? To speak of it as not only bound by the limitations of the relatives, not only, sorry, I'm reading wrong, not only not bound, okay, not only not bound, the absolute is not bound by the relativity. The relativities have no influence on the absolute at all. Okay? But as if it were bound by its freedom from limitations. Even that it does not have. There is no possibility of limitations in the divine. That's what it is. Inexorably empty of all power for relations, and in its nature incapable of them. Something hostile in its whole being to relativity and its eternal contrary. This is what the mind thinks. God is separate, the world is separate. Infinity is something, finiteness is something totally different, opposite. But this false step of our logic, by this false step, we get into an impasse, a dead end. Okay? Our own existence and the existence of the universe become not only a mystery, but logically inconceivable. Our own existence also, I'm in the physical world and I'm seeing the many, therefore I don't exist. And the existence of the universe also disappears when you go to the spiritual levels of consciousness. That was the solution of the Buddhists also. Get away from the universe and get away from, then all your suffering will end. The existence of the universe become not only a mystery, but logically inconceivable. For we get by that to an absolute which is incapable of relativity and exclusive of all relatives, and yet the cause, or at least the support of relativity, and the container, truth and substance of all relatives. Because we have seen that the world exists, we are seeing the world, it exists. So we have a problem. It seems to be unconnected, yet it is supporting the relativity. We have then only one logical, illogical way of escape out of the impasse. We have to suppose, it's a premise that you make. The imposition of the world as a self-effective illusion or an unreal temporal reality. Unreal temporal reality. It is unreal in the sense that it is not lasting forever. Okay? So, there can be two ideas. Illusion, Buddhism. Unreal temporal reality, Shankara. Okay? On the eternity of the formless, relationless absolute. The formless, relationless, the absolute. The immutable, infinite, eternal is different from the finite relativities. This imposition is made by our misleading individual consciousness, which falsely sees Brahman in the figure of the cosmos. When we are seeing only the cosmos. As a man mistakes a rope for a serpent. At night, Shankara's image is, at night you are walking and your leg hits a rope, but you think it's a snake and you jump up. When in the daytime you see it's only a rope. And the daytime is when you go to the spiritual level of consciousness. The night is when you are in ignorance at a normal level of the human mind. When you wake up, you see that the, there is there is no sneak at all. In one chapter, Sremda discusses this, okay, and he says that all these images also are not really what they are trying to say. But that's a huge discussion. We'll come to that later on. Okay. As a man mistakes a rope for a serpent, but since either our individual consciousness is itself a relative, supported by the Brahman, and only existent by it, not a real reality, or since in its reality it is itself the Brahman, it is Brahman after all which imposes on itself in us this delusion and mistakes in some figure of its own consciousness an existent rope for a non-existent snake, imposes on its own indeterminable pure reality the semblance of a universe. Or if it does not impose it on its own consciousness, it is on a consciousness derived from it and dependent on it, a projection of itself into Maya. Oh, he is going into great detail and saying there can be so many different interpretations. If we go into that, it will be very confusing. So just keep the basic idea in mind. Either you see the physical world as a total unreality, or you see it as a unreality in time and space. It does not last forever. If your definition of reality is that it should last forever, then the physical world is unreal in time and space. But the universe itself is not unreal. The forms in it are unreal. Okay? By this explanation, nothing is explained. What is the explanation he wants? He wants that there is a complete reconciliation between spirit and matter. You are not getting that with the mind, nor are you getting that with the spiritual level of consciousness. They seem to be different. That's what it is. By this explanation, nothing is explained. The original contradiction stands where it was, unreconciled. And we have only stated it over and over again in other terms. So, Shankara does not say that the physical world is unreal because he accepts Sarvam Khalu Idam Brahman. He accepts all the Upanishads. And one of the Upanishads very clearly says, everything is the Brahman. Sarvam Khalu Idam Brahman. Everything is indeed the Brahman. He accepts that. So how can you say that Shankara is a Mayavadin? You can't say that. So his philosophy is, the world is relatively real. It is real in time and space. It comes and disappears. So that's what it looks as if by attempting to arrive at an explanation by means of intellectual reasoning, we have only befogged ourselves by the delusion of our own uncompromising logic. We have imposed on the Absolute the imposition which our too presumptuous reasoning has practiced on our own intelligence. We are insisting on the law of contraries. That's what Satan is saying. But then you have to accept that the mental logic is not the ultimate instrument of knowledge. If you do that, there is no problem. But if you insist on logic being the only solution, then you have a problem. You have a problem in this sense that you see a division between spirit and matter. Those who think that the physical world is unreal and the only reality is the divine, and you have to go there by leaving the physical world, they have no problem. They accept it very happily. The world is unreal and I am going to the divine, infinite divine, and I am very happy with it. But keep in mind always that Srivanda wants even the lowest also to become divine. He is always wanting to marry the soil to the sky. The others are not even interested in this marriage of soil to sky. That's what he is explaining here. All his explanations are always wanting not compromise, a conciliation, a absolute harmony between spirit and matter. So, we come to the next one. We have transformed our mental difficulty in understanding the world manifestation into an original impossibility of the Absolute to manifest itself in the world at all. God is different from the world if you are stuck in the mental consciousness. But the Absolute obviously finds no difficulty in world manifestation and no difficulty either in a simultaneous transcendence of world manifestation. Why is Sri Aurobindo saying this? Because when you go into the spiritual level of consciousness, three possibilities are there, if you remember. Number one, you see the physical world as unreal. Okay. Number two, you are in the cosmic consciousness and the physical world is real. Because when you are in the cosmic consciousness, you are also in the cosmos and the cosmos is real to you. You can't reject it. So that's why he's saying this. Okay, he's saying Absolute has no difficulty at all in world manifestation and no difficulty either in a simultaneous transcendence of world manifestation. So, and the third possibility is like Sri Aurobindo's case, he saw the physical world as unreal, but he did not jump to conclusions. Okay, he said that how can I accept that the physical world is unreal? There must be some other plane of consciousness which explains this mystery. And then he looked more and found that there is something beyond even the overmind. There is a supermind where you see things in a totally different way. That's what it is. In fact, when he realized the overmind consciousness in 1926, okay, 24th November, then he realized that the overmind is not yet the ultimate reality. You have to go even farther up. And then he withdrew himself for that work. Okay. The difficulty exists only for our mental limitations which prevent us from grasping the supramental rationality of the coexistence of the infinite and the finite, or seizing the nodus of the unconditioned with the conditioned. If you are experiencing the cosmic consciousness, you will not make this mistake. But when you are going to the spiritual levels of consciousness through the experience of the self, it is very likely that you will see the physical world as unreal. Even Sri Aurobindo did. Okay? So then you come to this contradiction, that the world and God are different. But you need not, that's not an absolute necessity at all. For our intellectual rationality, these are opposites. For the absolute reason, they are interrelated and not essentially conflicting expressions of one and the same reality. Not the physical, not the language, okay? They are interrelated and not essentially conflicting expressions. Because when you are in the normal consciousness of man, they are conflicting expressions, okay? But not essentially. If you go to the essence of both, they are the same. And the same. The consciousness of infinite existence is other than our mind consciousness and sense consciousness. Greater and more capacious. The supramental consciousness is much greater than the mental consciousness. In fact, there are three levels. Huh? The sense consciousness and mind consciousness are the level 1. The level 2 is the spiritual planes of consciousness, where you see the physical world as unreal. And the last one is when you go to the highest level, yes, there are forms which are relatively unreal, but behind the forms there is a reality which is supporting the forms. That's what is. The consciousness of infinite existence is other than our mind consciousness and sense consciousness, greater and more capacious, greater to even accommodate the contraries, for it includes them as minor terms of its workings, and the logic of infinite existence is other than our intellectual logic. Now that's a very interesting thing, because Sri Aurobindo says that the way to go to the self is not only one. You don't necessarily have to silence the mind. Okay? He says there's another way. He says that in another place. He says that instead of silencing the mind and killing the mind, okay, you expand it. Include everything in it. That's a positive way. The negative way is constantly thinking, I am not the mind, I am not the mind, I am not the mind, and thoughts are not the reality. This is one way. This is a negative way. But there is another way, much more difficult. He says that somewhere, he says elsewhere, that you can expand the mind and not contract it and kill it. So there are so many different ways of realizing the truth. Okay? It reconciles. What reconciles? The supramental logic. It reconciles in its greater primal facts of being what to our mental view, concerned as it is with words and ideas derived from secondary facts, are irreconcilable contraries. What are the secondary facts? The forms in the physical world. They are the secondary facts. Stones, trees, okay? All these are secondary facts. What are the primary facts? The absolute blank from which they come. They are the primary facts. Okay? So, little complicated, and we have gone into details, and sometimes the details can be very confusing. So just remember, there are many philosophies depending on which level of consciousness you are stuck. Okay? The materialist is stuck at level 1. He thinks the physical world is the only reality. Level 2, spiritual planes of consciousness. You see the physical world as unreal. And that is true at that level, because the stone and the trees and our bodies are all, they are born and they die. There is no essential reality to them. But the essential reality is the soul. It never dies. Okay? It is always eternally living, immortal. So, and the third level, you see the two terms of existence, absolute and relative, the one and the many, the infinite and the finite, as being one. They are really essentially the same. They change the form. Outer form changes. That's a fact. Just like water is essentially water, but it can become water vapor and it can also become ice. But essentially all the three are only water. That's the absolute. But the absolute can become the relative by becoming a cloud, by becoming an ice. Ice is the physical world. The water vapor is the absolute. You can think of it that way. Okay? So, 8:32. We've got 3 minutes only. So, we'll leave it there. And if there are any other things or you want some clarification, we can go to that. But otherwise, we don't have much time now. We have got only 3 minutes. So we will stop at this place, and next time we'll take about our mistake is that in trying. And he will tell you what the problems are, how the mind makes a mistake. Our mistake is that in trying. Can we stop here today?
Maybe.